Teotihuacan is a beautiful place, and the fact that it has to do with the Miztec, the Olmec, and all the other tribes that sort of were there in its foundation is something beautiful in itself. It shows that civilizations suddenly grow larger when there's collaboration and mixture, taking great ideas and putting them all together. We find ourselves staring into giant cities made by these Native Americans, and we do not know what to make of them except to admire and dream. Their lives, their dreams, their religion, everything about these people was as solid as these rocks they built with. Yet, we today think of them as lost or needing some other explanation outside of who exactly they were. A fascinating people. They are not an exception around the world. In fact, everything seems very typical. If you get a lot of civilizations that come together, you get a much better civilization. Now, everything in the modern world is seen through the context of the quote unquote victors, the Europeans, which is why no matter where you go around the world, you always have to put a statement like pre Columbian. In my eyes, that pollutes the story. The story of these Native Americans have nothing to do with Columbus. In fact, they have nothing to do with anybody except the people who are living in the Americas. And this is where the story gets interesting. Humble origins. Most civilizations around the world actually have a very humble origin, which is why 90% of the time, when civilizations are thought to have come from somewhere else, they actually come from themselves. And you can always tell this because of humble origins, such as pottery. We know that the Native Americans developed pottery all on their own, even though their pottery was slightly later than that in Africa and Asia. And of course, I like the Americas because they debunk a whole swath of ideas made up by people that if you find beakers or whatever that have the same shape as other places, that means that they come from the same place. But we find all kinds of things in the pre developed Americas and the post developed Americas that don't match anything outside of the Americas. Or they match physically, but they don't match historically. Now, going back to this point of the West pointing the narrative, even today, directing the narrative, we have civilizations all over South America, but people don't really know them. They know about a lot of those in Mexico, and they know about some Native Americans, even the ones that aren't as, let's use the word sophisticated, as the ones in South America, even though there's some sophisticated ones, very sophisticated ones in the United States. And the reason for this is probably very simple because those states are popular today. The things that lie on there are popular. Tiwanaku, for example, is one of those places where if I'd ask 90% of people, they would have no idea outside of America. They would have no idea what I'm talking about, even though it's one of the most fascinating of the American civilizations. It's safe to say that though the art in the Americas is very similar to each other and has this, I don't know, blockiness about it, smooth blockiness, I guess, or what I call it, it's really nothing like anything outside of the Americas. I've seen nothing like this really anywhere, whether you talk about Asia, Egypt, Europe, or anywhere else. And I don't really see the problem with that because they are their own civilization and they develop their own stuff in their own way with their own time. Now, of course, the humble days are over if you look at this pottery. I mean, they've reached a sense or a point where they can't help themselves but develop better things. The cool thing about the Americas is that there are actually lost technologies which are speculated by real historians and by, any historian that seem to have developed our modern world as we know it. And remember, and this is well the part that I hate, remember that the quote unquote pre-Columbian era does not mean that the post-Columbian era has nothing to do with the Native Americans. And this is the main point of the video, that when black people start coming from Africa and they are introduced to the Native Americans and join them, they are as Native American as anybody else. Right above Tuanaku is Huari, and Huari itself is a marvel. It's one of these things that you look at and you go, wait a minute, they built that? But like I said, it's not just pyramids, it's not just roads, it's not things that we see in the ancient worlds where there's like logic behind it. In other words, they take time to develop those things, but then when you go to the Americas, they seem to have always been there conceptually. And so it confuses us. Like, why is it that in some places things have to be, they have to take some kind of rational step to get there, and for some people it seems more obvious? It's hard to imagine now, but just think of someone walking down this passageway, what they would have been thinking about their civilization compared to all the others around them. Would they have honestly thought that their civilization cannot be surpassed versus any other in the world? And in some ways, they were right. In some ways, there was nothing close to their civilization at the time. Nothing to question their authority, nothing to question their way of life, nothing to make their culture seem incorrect, nothing to make them want to change or even have to change. And even the small changes they would make were all still in the context of the Americas. For example, the Moche civilization in Peru. Look at how fascinating this place is and how fascinating its art is. Yet again, if you look carefully, you can see that it's all in the context of the Americas. And I don't know why they always have these eyes with are like very wide open, and it's sort of this scary dragon like face. I don't know what necessarily that represents, but they have that and it's everywhere. And all these symbols around these areas, which probably represent some kind of, and we're using this word, pre writing. The people who built this, again, would be Native Americans, and they would be more fascinating if had they come from another place, but yet we still find that these people look and act and build like all the other natives that we have seen. But this monopoly of their island can only last for so long. It is the Moors and the West Africans which probably started this want to vacate to the Americas, and possibly had heard or even seen people who had crossed to that region. And I do not cancel out the idea that some people even made it to the Americas. Why? Well, of all the written accounts that come at this time, The only people that we have actual writing that they actually purposefully went to the Americas in the direction of the Americas are these West Africans, including the Moors. Why? Why were they the people who did this? Well, it's obvious. What goes west more than Africa? And in fact, we know from modern times that it wouldn't be that difficult, especially given the fact that they had large ships in Africa, for them to make it to those regions. Some people say, where's the evidence? And of course, I played a video that shows you that there's already people who suggest the evidence that's there. Now, of course, we're talking about a later period after thousands of years of development in the Americas uninterrupted. If we look at this map by Al-Masudi and we see the English translation, we can see here that he includes continents that are beyond what we have today. So let's first see the ones that are typical. So we can see that there's Sudan, Maghreb. So this is Africa right here at the bottom. I've turned it upside down because the world used to be, the north used to be south and south used to be north. You can see there's Slavs. You can see there Turks at the top. So this is Al Masudi's map, and he shows, outer going that way, and which is west, and then east going that way. But remember, Al Masudi also mentions Kashkash, who was the traveler who traveled west and came back with treasures. We know not of any place that had the types of treasures that were mentioned outside of the Americas. And remember, Kashkash predates the Musa that went to the Americas by about 200 years. Generally, it's agreed that this story was actually one of the most popular to the Moors at the time, for no one had done something so great in its history. And also the fact that the knowledge of how big and how impressive they would need to travel such a distance. The only opponents to this idea is that the people who made the story might have made it up as a narrative. That's the best they can come up with for why they believe it didn't happen. But if that idea that they made up is fake, then that means Kashkash or Koshkash made it to the Americas and returned to tell the tale. I will first read the part that has to do with the civilization, and then I will read the part that has to do with just in general, so that I can show you that nothing about the way he's writing this it suggests that he's saying that this is fictional. So it says there are some wonderful stories related respecting it, for which we refer the reader to our book, the Akbar Ez-Zaman, which means the our times. There he will find an account of those crews who have risked their lives in navigating the sea, and who of them have escaped and who have been shipwrecked, also what they have encountered and seen. Such an adventurer was a Moor of Spain, of the name of Koshkosh. He was a young man of Cordoba. Having assembled some young men, they went on board a vessel which they had ready on the ocean, and nobody knew for a long time what had become of them. At length they came back, loaded with rich booty. Their history is well known among the people of El-Andalus. The length of this strait, which forms a current from the ocean into the Mediterranean, is considerable, extending from the mentioned pillars as far as Al-Ajar. The current from the ocean is so great that it is precipitable from the Sea of Arum of Syria and Egypt. A gulf branches off, which is 500 miles long and passes the city of Rome. Now, nothing about that is referring to a fictional story. In fact, he mentions this person as if it's someone that is known in the town as a legitimate person, and he only mentions him as one of the people who makes it back from the Americas, but he's probably the most successful, meaning he actually returned with treasures to speak of. So he starts off by naming the Mediterranean Sea. This will give us a clue about what exactly he's talking about. So he says, the Sea of Erum, which is Rome, of Tarsus, Turkey, Adana, this is another place near Turkey, El Masisa, another place in Turkey, Antiochia, yeah, Antioch, you can see the translation there, El Ladikia, and Laodicea, Atropolis, which is Tripoli. So this is the Mediterranean that he's just described, and of other places on the coast of Syria and Egypt, as of Alexandria, and on the coast of the Maghreb is 5,000 miles long. This is him describing the Mediterranean Sea as 5,000 miles long. The breadth varies, being in some places 800 miles, in others 700, 600, and less. So it is stated in the astronomical works of many authors of astronomical tables, as Muhammad bin Jabir el-Batini. This sea begins from the strait which connects it to the Sea of Oceanus, the Atlantic, and which is narrowest between the coast of Tangier, the Tangiers, and Sabta in the Maghreb, and between the coast of El Andalus, Spain. This narrow passage has the name of Ceuta. The distance between the two coasts is not more than 10 miles. Hence, it is the route to cross over from the Maghreb to El Andalus, and from El Andalus into the Maghreb. It is generally called the Zokak, or the lane. We shall speak in our account of Egypt of the bridge which joined the two coasts, and of the navigation of the sea. Also, that the island of Corbros, Cyprus, and El Arish were once connected by the land, so that caravans passed from one place to another. On the limits where these two seas, the Mediterranean and the ocean join, pillars of copper and stone have been erected by King Hirakul the giant. Upon these pillars are inscriptions and figures which show with their hands that one cannot go further, and that it is impractical to navigate beyond the Mediterranean into that sea. Now, let me quickly explain a couple things about what I just read so that we can all be on the same level. King Hirakul is Hercules, and the giant copper things that have been erected are the pillars of Hercules, which is what they're called. So these two things that separate the two continents. So in Europe you have the pillar and you have that, and it's thought that Hercules, well, separated this area because of those pillars. Now, the pillars of Hercules have always just been a symbol for those two things that are like mountains that sort of are on the other side, either side of these two continents that face each other. So let's carry on. On the limits where these two seas, the Mediterranean and the ocean, join, pillars of copper and stone have been erected by King Hirakal the giant. Upon these pillars are inscriptions and figures which show with their hands that one cannot go beyond the Mediterranean into that sea, the ocean, for no vessel sails on it. There is no cultivation nor a human being, and the sea has no limits, neither in its depth nor extent, for its end is unknown. This is the Sea of Darkness, also called the Green Sea or the Surrounding Sea. Some say that these pillars are not on this strait, but in some island of the ocean and their coast. Some people consider the sea as the origin of all others. And then we get back to what he was talking about. There are some wonderful stories related respecting it, for which we refer the reader to our book Akbar Zaman. There he will find an account of those crews who have risked their lives in navigating the sea. He's talking about the Atlantic Ocean. Remember, the ocean. I mean, they put it in brackets there for us to make it easier. And who of them have escaped and who have been shipwrecked, also what they have encountered and seen. Such an adventurer was a Moor of Spain of the name Koshkash. He was a young man of Cordoba. Having assembled some young men, they went on board a vessel which they had ready on the ocean, and nobody knew for a long time what had become of them. At length they came back, loaded with rich booty. Their history is well known among the people of El Andalus. Now, the only reason I'm going to read the next part is because with this previous information, now it'll make complete sense. The length of the strait, which forms a current from the ocean into the Mediterranean, is considerable. The current from the ocean is so great that it is perceptible from the Sea of Irum, Rome, of Syria and Egypt. A gulf branches off which is 500 miles long and passes the city of Rome. This gulf is called the Adriatic in the language of the Romans, west of the strait. Now, don't get me wrong, it's quite obvious that the Atlantic and even the Americas would have been something unknown to most of the people living in that region. But stories like this definitely, without a doubt, are the reason why. I mean, people from almost the exact same location would discover America later, discover, whatever for themselves, by themselves to discover, but obviously a bunch of people had discovered it before them, including the Native Americans. The quote unquote discoveries that would come, we have shown in other videos. I don't know if I should go back, but we have shown in other videos that they did everything they can to find historical people who had traveled that side. And we even find in Al Masudi's book talks of how China is the closest to the Atlantic Ocean. So if you go around, you will see that from China you can go all the way to the Atlantic. Whereas you remember, what's his name? Columbus was trying to get to India, which kind of didn't make sense because there was still going to be so many other places that were in the way. And of course, we know that the Muslims had seen some lower places close to the Australian, so Oceania as well. And because of this, they were way more ready to go to the Americas than the people of Europe. The people of Europe adopted, or well, I can call them the people of Europe, but these people as well were people of Europe. But the people of Europe who came later took on a lot of the things that they had developed, a lot of the lessons, a lot of stories like this one written here about the winds, which were described as dragons because of how fierce they were. Taking all of that, they were able to travel there. I mean, we like to make it like, oh, it was the first time anybody ever tried. No, we have actual writing that shows that many, many, many West Africans, I know some people pretend that it was just Mansa Musa or the guy who came before Mansa Musa, but it was a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of people who tried going there using small ships and big ships alike. But why would they do this? Didn't people know back in the day that the world was flat and therefore there was no point of traveling because there was a limit to everything? Well, like you read in the previous Al Masudi book, they didn't know where the limits were, but they knew that the world was a sphere, and they had already known this since ancient Egypt. Now, ancient Egyptians in the beginning thought the world was flat, but when they went around Africa, it became obvious to them because of how the sun moved that the earth was actually spherical. And this is documented by Herodotus. Libya is in the other tract, for Libya commences from Egypt. Now, in Egypt, this tract is narrow, for from the sea to the Red Sea are the 100,000 Ogre, which make 1,000 stadies. But from this narrow neck, the tract which is called Libya becomes very wide. I wonder, therefore, at those who have described the limits and divided Libya, Asia, and Europe, for the difference between them is not trifling, for in length Europe extends along both of them. But with respect to width, it is evidently not to be compared. Libya shows itself to be surrounded by water, except so much of it as borders upon Asia. Necho, king of Egypt, was the first whom we know of that proved this. He, when he was had seized, digging the canal leading from the Nile to the Arabian Gulf, sent certain Phoenician ships with orders to sail back through the Pillars of Hercules. We've already discussed that. So into the northern sea, and so to return to Egypt. Remember, this is ancient Egypt. Necho is a pharaoh. The Phoenicians, accordingly, setting out from the Red Sea, navigated the southern sea. When autumn came, they went ashore and sowed the land by whatever part of Libya they happened to be sailing. Now, this is an important part that we need to stop on because it says that the Phoenicians actually landed somewhere in Africa before they set sail again. And this is the part that is missed when they talk about them going around Africa, which is that the Phoenicians did land. And so some people in somewhere in Africa would have encountered these people and waited for harvest. Oh, wait, by the way, before I carry on, and this will come in as part of evidence that I'm talking about when people say that some Bantu tribes or some whatever they might have been fueled by runaway or whatever Egyptians. This is going to be one of the things that I explore about that. And waited for harvest. Then, having reaped the corn, they put to sea again. When 2 years had thus passed, in the third, having doubled the Pillars of Hercules, they arrived in Egypt, and related what to me does not seem credible, but may to others, that as they sailed round Libya, they had the sun on their right hand. Thus was Libya first known. Subsequently, the Carthaginians say that Libya is surrounded by water, for Satypus, son of Teias purpose on the Achaemenida did not sail round Libya, though sent for the very purpose, but dreading the length of the voyage and the desolation return home. Now, I'm not going to read the next part, but starting with that person, the comedian people, and Xerxes and all these other people, you can see that there were a series of failures to try and go around Africa. So this is one of the evidences I use, that when people say the Phoenicians or any other people could have made it to America, these people could barely make it around Africa. So to say that these guys could have made it to America is ridiculous. Now the next part will show how these people thought that their nations were actually connected to each other. The seas were connected to each other. I suppose this gulf is connected with the Sea of Maertus and the Pontus through the narrow northern passage, and that the invading nations were the Russians, of whom we have spoken, for on other nation sails in the seas which stand in connection to the ocean. In the Mediterranean, not far from Crete, planks of vessels of Indian plantain wood have been found, which were well cut and joined with fibers of the coconut tree. It was evident that they were of wrecked vessels and had been a long time in water. Vessels of this description are only found in the Abyssinian Sea, for the vessels of the Mediterranean and of the West are all joined with nails. In the Abyssinian Sea, iron nails would not be applicable for ship building, for the water of that sea corrodes the iron, and the nails become thinner and weaker in the water. Hence the planks are joined with fibers and besmeared with grease and quicklime. This is a proof that the sea have a communication. The seas towards China and the country of Asila goes all around the country of the Turks, and has a communication with the sea of the west, the Atlantic, through some straits of the great ocean. On the coast of Syria, Ambergris has been found thrown on shore, although it has never been a production of the Mediterranean Sea in ancient times, and it is possible that it came there through the same way by which we suppose that the planks of the vessels came from the Sea of China. God knows best. The Sea of Spain abounds in ambergris, and it is exported from Spain to Egypt. So basically, the argument he's making is that things that are found in other seas will be found in other seas because those seas are joined together, meaning either people travel there or those things eventually get drifted there because the seas have a communication. That's the word, but they are so joined that something that comes from Abyssinia can be found in the Atlantic, and something from the Atlantic can be found in the China Sea. So anywhere you can find anything. Now, this is only part one of a three-part video, because the second part of this has to be what was happening in the Americas when all of this was taking place. West Africa, the Moors, and the Muslim empires, and the stuff that was happening in Europe. Like, because remember, a lot of this is taking place in about 900 AD. The Americas were well established by that time. And so to know that this is what the people in the West were thinking, that they could come this way. But was there anyone in the West thinking that they could come east? What were they waiting for? And is it true that when Westerners finally landed on the shore, that the people in the Americas were already waiting for such a people? And could that be proof that people from the East had already arrived in the Americas? Now, here's a final connection that some people don't make. Remember, Ibn Fadlan wrote about the Vikings. The Vikings pretty much existed at the same time that the Muslims did. And Leif Erikson is an example of a Westerner ending up in the Americas. But the cool thing is, it happened just about the same time, or at least a little later than the date of Koshkosh. So the idea that it is impossible for someone who was stationed in Europe to make it to America is ridiculous.